The following is a recording of our live event, which took place on March 19th, 2026. We hope you enjoy our presentation. I have our presenters, Rachel and Brenna, with me, ready to take us for a spin through the seasonal slotting of spinach, variety recommendations, key traits to consider, and more. Now, I'd like to take a moment to speak briefly to some of the work that takes place on our farm. Pictured here is the Johnny's Research Farm located in Albion, Maine. Our farm is the heart of Johnny's and has been since we moved our company there in 1975. In all, we manage approximately 200 acres of land across 11 sites in central Maine. Of that, we're trialing crops, producing seed, breeding cultivars, and more. We grow and trial varieties on our farm in Maine and on the farms of regional growing partners across the US and Canada, selecting only those varieties that meet our vigorous standards. In 2025, on our main farm alone, we planted over 3,200 varieties across 30 miles of bed feed as part of our yearly trialing efforts. Of those, little more than 175 new products met our high standards and were selected from those trials for 2026. Our presenters today are Rachel Katz and Brenna Chase. Rachel has been working on farms for over 20 years and has held her current position of trials technician at our research farm for the last 10. She oversees our spinach trials, as well as other leafy greens, microgreens, peppers, and eggplants. Brenna is our spinach product manager. She also manages other leafy greens, microgreens, and peppers, and is responsible for managing the product assortment for these crops, as well as overseeing the product development targets of Johnny's pepper, sweet chard, greens breeding programs. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Rachel and Brenna so that we can get started.
Great, thanks, Joshua. Hi, everyone. Just a few comments to kick us off here about the spinach trialing program that we are running here at Johnny's. So we run 5 spinach trials a year. They are in the spring, summer, and fall. And then we have 2 trials in the winter tunnel setting, so a September seeding and then a February seeding. And running these year-round trials really allows us to observe the same varieties across different seasonal slots and see trait expression under varying environmental conditions. And doing that helps us really identify the strengths and weaknesses of each variety. And that allows us to make good recommendations to you about where and how to grow the particular varieties. We typically have any given variety in our trials 3 or more years before they're commercially available on the market, or we would put them in our catalog. And because we're really focusing our trials on that pre-commercial development stage where the breeding companies have not released the varieties, we're able to spend quite a lot of time with each variety, really understanding their particularities before they come to you in our catalog. And this lets us be quite confident in our slotting recommendations and sort of provide an additional set of information. We'll talk later at length about downy mildew, but just to note here, a large part of the reason that we do focus on that pre-commercial stage is to ensure that we can pivot quickly between varieties given the quick advancing of the downy mildew pathogen and then the subsequent race updates within the breeding programs. As Johnny's does really across all crops, our goal in spinach is to work with a wide range of breeding companies from global industry leaders to small independent breeders. This allows us to access and choose from the best available genetics on the market. As you are probably aware, the majority market for spinach here in the US is really in the majority production area, I should say, is really California and Arizona. And so there's often a lot of performance information accompanying the varieties as they're moving through the early stage breeding programs. And as a result, we are focusing our trials on understanding variety performance in locations outside of those regions. So, for example, in the winter tunnel environment that you'll hear more about, as well as the northern tier and other regions of the US. We do run trials outside of our location here in the Northeast to investigate and confirm variety performance in a range of geographic regions.
So now to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of spinach, we're going to start with planting. The best way to plant spinach is to direct seed it. On the research farm, we use the Jang JP1 seeder. We choose rollers for that seeder based on seed size and desired plant density. The best rollers for spinach seed are the MJ24 roller, L24, LJ24, and LV24. Those are listed in order from smallest to largest, with the MJ having the smallest hole and then the LV having the largest hole. Now, the Jang is designed so you can singulate the seed or use multiple seeds, and you can use a larger hole if you want to drop more than one seed at a time. The best rollers for singulation are the MJ and the L24 roller, and the best for multiple seeds are the LJ and the LV roller. For multiple seeds is better in the fall and winter when the bolting pressure is lower. In the spring and summer, you're going to want to keep the plantings a little less dense to slow bolting. And we'll discuss density a little more later on. But one of the really nice things about the Jangs, it's very easy to customize. We did a webinar about that a few years ago, and we're going to link to that in the chat. And at the end of the webinar, we have a resources page that we'll link to that as well. We also sell a spinach seed roller starter pack that includes the MJ and the L24 rollers for the singulation. The MJ and the L24 rollers. The LJ and the LV rollers, which hold more seed, or if you need to plant very large seed, and those you can purchase separately. You can also use the Earthway seeder. It's less precise than the Jang. The best plates that are available for the Earthway for spinach seed are the radish or the beet Swiss chard plates. You could also use the 6-row seeder or the pinpoint seeders. Each of those come with a rod with different sized holes for seeding different crops. You're probably going to want to use the largest hole for spinach seed. These seeders are also work well for seeding various greens and baby leaf crops as well. Because the hoppers are very close together, you're going to want to decide ahead of time how many rows per bed you want and how far apart you want those rows to be. You can always skip sections of the hopper if you want to sow your rows farther apart in the 6-row seeder or the 4-row pinpoint seeder. You could also transplant your spinach. It's a little bit non-traditional, but it's very effective in that it doesn't require field germination. Germination can be difficult in the summer and fall because of warm soil temperatures. And it can also be used in the spring to manage wet fields. And in the winter tunnel, if you want to transplant, that pushes back the date that you need to empty your tunnel so you can keep your summer tomatoes in there as long as possible. The paper pot transplanter works pretty well for that because you can transplant real easily at higher density.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what traits you want to think about when you're choosing varieties that you would grow in your particular production plan. And so the first set of considerations in spinach is really about leaf type. That's kind of the major initial way that spinach gets broken down into categories. And so we have Savoy, semi-Savoy, and smooth leaf, covering the range from very flat to very Savoy leaf. The image in the kind of in the center of the slide here of hammerhead, that's our example of a full Savoy leaf. And what you have is like that maximum leaf texture, so very blistered leaf surface and then a cupped leaf. And this is a really traditional appearance for spinach. It's very attractive and adds a lot of loft when you're packing that into a bag or a clamshell. So a very, very nice option for spinach. One of the drawbacks is that as that leaf is growing, it can tear at the apex or the tip of the leaf because of that extreme cupping. And also, if the cupping is kind of folding over on itself, you can kind of clip the tip of that leaf in the harvest process. So both of those, of course, problematic when that goes into your package and goes to the customer. On the other side of the spectrum, the example on this slide is space for a smooth leaf spinach. And with a smooth leaf, of course, what you have is a very flat leaf. So you have almost no cupping at all, and then very little texture on the leaf. And what's nice about this leaf type is that the plant can reach your leaf spec that you're trying to achieve really quickly. The plant's not building any kind of texture at all, so it's going to hit your width and length, specs that you're going for kind of as quickly as it can. Very flat leaf is not ideal. However, when you get to the packing process, the leaves will stick together, can be more problematic there, and generally not as attractive as that full Savoy. However, as everyone is very familiar with, this is kind of the majority type that you're seeing in the grocery store now. The baby leaf market is absolutely focused on a smooth leaf spinach leaf type. So now very familiar to eaters in the United States. And then in the middle, of course, we have what's called semi-savoy. And here what you get is that blistering across the leaf, but very little cupping. And so it's a nice kind of middle ground between the pros and cons of the full Savoy and then that smooth leaf leaf type. Also on this slide, just kind of a quick nod to some specialty types. So the majority of the spinach varieties that you'll encounter are going to be kind of those top three images, those kind of standard leaf types in varying degree of Savoy. However, there is a whole category of spinach out in the world that is this Oriental Asian leaf type. This type is typically grown as a bunching spinach. You can see in that image the nicely bunched plants. So it's a very tall, long petiole leaf. This is the predominant type in many parts of Asia. And this is meant to be a cooking spinach, so larger leaf. You can see that sort of classic arrowhead shape. This is a nice option for a home garden or for a specialty market that's looking for this type. And then in the center bottom of the slide, the example we have here is red snapper of a red vein spinach. So there's a handful of varieties on the market. Johnny's also carries red tabby, which is more of a traditional oval leaf type with that red vein. This one, specifically the red snapper, is also kind of interesting because you can see that lobed leaf. It's a little bit like a dandelion leaf or an arugula leaf, and it can be grown at very high density and used as like a cutting product for baby leaf. We'll move on to the next slide. Some more trait considerations when thinking about what spinach variety you want to choose. So the first is speed. And speed, basically, we can think about speed in spinach in three different ways. You will have varieties that grow quickly, but also bolt quickly. And so those are well suited for the fall and winter where there's very little bolting pressure and where that extra vigor can be an advantage. Then you can have varieties that are slow growing and also slow bolting. And those are ideal to use in the spring and summer where you're going to have heavy bolting pressure on the plants, but less of a need for a real speed to get the plant moving. And then the sort of unicorn combination of traits with speed here would be to have moderate or fast growth, but slow bolting. Very hard to come by. When we do encounter those varieties, they're wonderful because they can be used really all year round, and they become a very important all-purpose variety. Rachel's going to talk in just a minute about the variety recommendations that we have that would fall into each of these categories. So then we can move on to plant habit. In spinach, we have very upright plants that are standing up tall off the ground, very easy to harvest. And then there's a plant habit where the leaves are prostrate and they're lying on the ground or close to the ground, and they're more difficult to harvest. The market, the breeding industry, of course, is interested in that upright habit. That's where the selection tends to focus, but there's definitely prostrate varieties out on the market. And it's good to know what you're going to get when you're shopping for a variety. And then the other piece of plant habit is the petiole length of the spinach leaves. So you can have, like you saw in the example of that bunching spinach, the Asian type, very, very long petioles. And when that's combined with an upright habit, they're sort of a breeze to harvest. You can also have very short petioles that makes a very compact plant and can be a little bit more challenging to harvest. And then for leaf shape, pretty straightforward. There's sort of what we call like a lollipop leaf, perfectly round, and then oval, and then a more angular leaf, going to that extreme of the sort of Christmas tree shape of the Asian spinach. For color, not a lot of color options in spinach, but you do see variation in green. So in recent years, the industry has really moved towards darker and darker spinach. The compromise with color is often that you start to lose speed. The darker that the leaf gets, the more time the plant's taking to build that chlorophyll. But yeah, more and more the options on the market are very dark, but there are sort of medium green and paler green spinaches. And then, of course, the red vein, red petiole specialty type. And then finally, disease resistance in the particular varieties that you're looking at. So, of course, it's important to know what diseases are occurring in your area. Downy mildew is prevalent through much of the country during certain planting slots. There's a range of leaf spot diseases, Stemphylium, Cladosporium, bacterial leaf spot that can be problematic. In the south, white rust is an issue with spinach. So, identify what diseases could occur in your region, or if you're producing spinach, make sure you know what the issues are you're encountering, and then you can seek out those resistances. And we'll talk more about spinach diseases at the end of the presentation as well.
Sorry about that. Brenna talked a lot about things to consider about individual varieties, but there are also environmental factors to consider. These seasonal considerations, which we'll talk about more in depth when we talk about each of the different seasonal growing slots. Day length, soil temperature, the other stressors that are associated with the various seasons, including moisture and temperature. Now, when we say those, we're talking about the highs and lows of each of those. Too much and too little moisture, very high and very low temperatures. There are ways to mitigate those effects no matter what seasonal slot you're in. And mostly this means trying to decrease bolting pressure, right? So you can do that by addressing spacing and plant density. Generally, plants that are grown at a higher density experience more stress, and they bolt faster than plants that are grown at lower density. They're competing for moisture, nutrients, and sunlight. And when they have more space and more access to those limited resources, they tend to bolt more slowly. It's easy to adjust density by fiddling with the jang rollers or the sprocket configuration. It's a little trickier with some of those other seeders, but you can also seed heavy and then thin your plots. I even worked on a farm that seeded pretty densely, and then at the first harvest, they harvested the full plants to thin to the desired density for the rest of the crop. Harvest size is also one way to decrease bolting. After germination, plants move into their vegetative growth phase before they move into their regenerative seed production phase. And plants that are harvested tend to bolt slower and stay longer in that vegetative growth phase than plants that are unharvested. So if you're harvesting with a knife, cut and come again style, if you harvest on the smaller side, you might be able to pull off an additional cut. And if you're harvesting individual leaves from larger plants, starting when the leaves are smaller will keep the plant vegetative and slow the progress into the reproductive phase. Making sure your irrigation is even and moisture stays even will also decrease bolting pressure. And also, especially, variety selection is an excellent way to maximize production in all of your seasonal slots. If you plant a fast-growing, fast-bolting variety in summer, no matter how many mitigation strategies you employ, it will be an uphill battle to grow summer spinach. But if you choose a slow-growing, slow-bolting variety, you will have a much higher chance of success. So the question, when can I grow spinach? And the answer is most of the time, depending on where you live. So 3 or 4 seasons of the year, it is possible to grow spinach, and your success is going to depend on a lot of different factors, and variety selection is an important one. So now we are going to talk about the seasonal slotting, starting with spring. So spring is a very common time to want to grow spinach. It's a quick spring crop. It can be eaten raw or cooked. People always want to buy spinach in the spring. But spring can be a little bit of a tricky time to grow spinach because there's relatively high bolting pressure. The days are getting longer and they're getting longer fast. So it's not just the hours of daylight, but also how much the daylight is changing. So even sometimes in cooler springs, we find higher bolting pressure in late May than we find in late June because of that increasing day length and the speed of the increasing day length. But when you throw heat and other stressors in, that isn't always the case. Another thing is that temperatures are increasing. That makes it tricky. Variable day and night temperatures can be challenging for the plants, and so can fluctuations in temperature from day to day. But the soil is still cool, which is mostly better for spinach germination. So spinach germinates between 45 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to take longer to germinate at lower temperatures, 2 weeks or more when the soil is very cold, or less than a week when the soil is in the 60s. But when the soil is very warm later in the season, the spinach seed may not germinate at all. We call that thermal dormancy. And we'll talk about keeping the soil cool when we get to the summer slot. I personally really like taking a soil thermometer out to the field. It's interesting. It's kind of a fun piece of data to monitor. We actually sell a very affordable, practical, easy to use, pocket-sized soil thermometer that Joshua will link in the chat. And just a quick note on taking soil temperature, put the tip of the thermometer down only as far as your seeds are going to go into the soil. If you put it 6 inches below the surface, it's going to look real cold, but your seeds are going to be planted at 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, and that's the more relevant information. Now, one of the downsides of cool, wet soil is that it is notoriously beneficial to pathogen emergence. And cold, wet soil can also lead to stunting, especially if the soil is compacted. So spinach likes to have aerated roots, and we routinely find that if you have trouble putting your plant stake into the soil because it's too compact, the spinach will have trouble growing. So not germinating necessarily, but thriving and being productive. There's some research out of the University of Florida that suggests that adding a thick layer of compost to the top of your soil and then seeding directly into that compost can help with germination. Their hypothesis is that it forms a barrier between soil pathogens like Pythium and Rhizoctonia and the germinating seed. And in this spring slot, this compost method could also warm up a little bit faster than the soil, and that can help speed up germination as well. So variety selection for spring. The fast-growing, fast-bolting varieties can work well. Because one of the goals of spinach planting in the spring is that it produces quickly, you want varieties that are going to get you a crop as soon as possible. These varieties produce baby and full-size leaves before they bolt, even in the spring. We really try not to select varieties that can't produce a spring crop because we know how important that is. So the varieties that we have in this category are Garanuk, Rangitoto, Tragopan, Flamingo Improved, Hammerhead, Equinox, and Bloomsdale. Hammerhead, Equinox, and Bloomsdale are full Savoy spinaches. Hammerhead is actually our fastest bolting spinach, so multiple harvests are unlikely in this slot. And if considerations are changing rapidly, it really might not be the best choice. Bloomsdale and Equinox are our 2 open pollinated spinach varieties. Flamingo Improved, like we saw when Brenna was talking about leaf type, is our Asian type spinach that has smooth angular leaves and very long petioles, primarily used for bunching. Tragopan is a smooth leaf variety with thick, oval, dark green leaves and long upright petioles, similar in some ways to the growth habit of Flamingo Improved, except it's really good for baby leaf, full size, or bunching. And its standout feature is that it is just very fast growing, producing high yields. And because of the long upright petioles, it's really easy to harvest. And if you've grown auroch in the past, this is a 1-for-1 replacement for auroch. Gerenuk and Rangitoto kind of round out that assortment, and they're also fast growing and upright, but they're semi-savoy varieties with round, blistered leaves, a little bit cupped. Rangitoto is a little bit more cupped than Gerenuk, and they're very glossy. They really have a very nice leaf. And this makes them have really nice loft in a bag, but it also makes them a little bit slower growing, and it reduces the overall leaf size. In this slot, you can also grow the slow growing, slow bolting varieties that do well here and in the summer. And these are mostly bred for baby leaf harvest, so the leaves don't get huge. They can be substantial and heavy, but they won't get bigger than, say, a teen leaf stage. So if you're looking for a full-size spinach, these are probably not the best varieties for you. And the varieties in this category are Lizard, Seaside, and Red Tabby. Lizard and Seaside are smooth leaf varieties. Seaside is spade-shaped, while Lizard is rounder. Red Tabby is angular, more red-veined, and all three of them are very slow bolting. And then there are the all-season varieties, Space, Sun Angel, and Tarsier. These varieties work in all of the seasonal slots because they're relatively fast-growing and relatively slow bolting, but they aren't necessarily optimized for all of the seasons. Space has a light green, thin, smooth leaf with prostrate habit. People grow it in all seasons, but spring is really its best slot. It grows these huge leaves. They're just like beach towels. They're huge. It isn't very refined, but it is very slow bolting, so it works very well in this high bolting pressure slot. It transitions from baby leaf to full size very quickly. So if you're looking for something to stay in spec for a long time, you should look to a different variety other than Space. Sun Angel and Tarsier, on the other hand, are round, semi-savoy, upright varieties with thick, turgid leaves. They're very similar to each other and very refined. They look great in all of the seasonal slots. They're somewhat faster bolting than Space, but much more refined varieties. So in the summer, we still have very high bolting pressure. The days are long. There's increased heat and humidity. And also now there's increased soil temperature, which can make germination difficult. So there are a few different ways for trying to cool down your soil. You can use evaporative cooling. So this is well known for like the swamp cooler technology that's ubiquitous in the South. It also works on soil. So you apply water, which will absorb a large amount of heat from the soil in order to evaporate, and then that cools the soil down as a result. You just want to make sure that you're not using so much water as to oversaturate your seed bed, which could rot the seed or trigger disease. You could also use tarping in your field. You make your beds first and then you irrigate them, and you cover the bed with a tarp that is black on the bottom and white on the top. And if you do this in the spring when the soil is still cool and then leave the tarp on until you're ready to seed, it doesn't substantially increase the soil temperatures, and it leaves you with a stale seed bed, so no weeds later. Also, shade cloth can be used and transplanting as well. So the best varieties for summer production are the slow growing, slow bolting varieties that we talked about for the spring, Seaside, Lizard, and Red Tabby, and also the all season varieties, Space, Tarsier, and Sun Angel. Now moving on to the fall. Overall, this is probably the easiest slot for spinach to grow. There's much decrease in bolting pressure with the shortening days and the cooler growing weather, but the soil is warm. So you have the same challenges that we talked about for tricky germination in the summer planting. You'll have those in the fall as well. So you're going to want to employ those same strategies that we talked about for summer: evaporative cooling, tarping, shade cloth, transplanting, to increase your success. The best varieties for fall overlap heavily with the best varieties for spring. The fast-growing, fast-bolting varieties: Gerenuk, Rangitoto, Tragopan, Flamingo Improved, Hammerhead, Equinox, and Bloomsdale. But remember, in this seasonal slot, the bolting is much less of a concern. For us, in most seasons, we don't get any bolting in our fall planting, which we seed in mid-August. Last fall was unusual. It was very long and very hot. So we did experience some bolting, but not enough to really make the varieties unharvestable. So when we say bolting, we're basically looking for the elongation of the flower stalk from the basal plate, but not necessarily full-blown flowering. Growers will have to really decide for themselves when it's too late to harvest spinach once bolting has initiated. Some varieties, the leaves stay very small once the bolting has initiated, but others like Rangitoto continue to stay somewhat vegetative and look great for a while, even after that flower stalk has initiated. And of course, the all-season varieties also work well here: Space, Sun Angel, and Tarsier. Now, the winter. The winter is a really interesting growing season, and it turns out that pretty much everyone can grow spinach in the winter. And it's delicious. The plants convert the carbohydrates into sugars to protect against the cold and produce the sweetest spinach you've ever had. Sometimes it's so candy-like that some of the eaters who work on the research farm can only stomach it in a smoothie. They won't even put it in a savory dish. It's too sweet. But we have found that in the north, even in the northern tier, we can have very successful spinach production in unheated tunnels all winter long. Of course, the growth does slow, but if you time it properly and rotate your harvest through the tunnel, you should be able to harvest weekly, if not more, through the winter. So on the research farm, we are at 44 degrees north, and we sow our first planting of winter tunnel spinach right around the fall equinox. Because of declining day length, if we push that seeding date even into early October, it delays the first harvest considerably. We find our first harvests with that equinox seeding date generally start around late October or early November, depending on weather and the variety. Tragopan, hands down, will be your earliest harvestable spinach variety in the winter tunnel. And this speed has made it one of our highest yielders every year we've had it in trial. Now, I do want to address the idea of the Persephone period. So there has historically been this theory, notably featured in the Winter Harvest Handbook by Elliott Coleman, suggesting that plants stop growing during the Persephone period, which the Persephone period is defined as the time of the winter when daylight falls below 10 hours a day. So on our research farm in Albion, Maine, that period runs from November 6th through February 8th, and that is a huge percentage of our winter season. But what we have found as the winters get warmer is that as long as the days are sunny and the nights stay above 0, the plants are able to gain enough warmth during what daylight they have to grow through the whole winter. So from some varieties, we're harvesting every 2 weeks, even during the coldest and darkest days of the year. So even if you have a long Persephone period like us, you can still have a very productive winter spinach tunnel. Because one of the real benefits to this seasonal slot is there is basically no bolting pressure. The plants are purely vegetative. Not until the days start getting longer in the spring, and for us that's around mid-March, right around now, does bolting begin to be an issue. So we get many harvests off of each plot. Last winter, we harvested 8 times off of plots of Gerenuk, Rangitoto, and Tragopan from late October through early March. And we do another planting in mid-February that we harvest in April and May. Bolting pressure is higher in this planting as the days are getting longer and more heat builds up in the tunnel environment. There are some tricky things about growing in the winter. One of them is increased disease pressure. So in the tunnel, we see a lot of Cladosporium leaf spot and spinach downy mildew, which Brenna will talk about specifically in a few minutes. With cooler temperatures, wetter soil, and humid conditions, the condensation on leaves, pathogens find susceptible hosts in the spinach tunnel, especially under row cover, where there is little opportunity for drying out. So if a farmer were to cover their spinach and leave the row cover on for a week or 2 and then uncover, it would not be surprising for them to find disease on their spinach. So you're going to want to make sure that if you cover your spinach at night to protect against cold temperatures, that you open the row cover during the day, especially if the sun comes out, to make sure your spinach has the opportunity to dry out and the soil dries out and the leaves dry out. So row cover is an important way to maximize spinach production in the winter tunnel, but we don't really know the temperature thresholds that are best for the use of row cover. Some people cover below freezing, some below 20 degrees. That's what we've historically done on the research farm. And some wait for even colder temps before they cover their spinach at night. But the research hasn't been done, so we don't actually know what best practices. So if anybody in the audience is looking to get a PhD across the northern tier, I would suggest that this be what they study. You don't even have to give me any credit for the suggestion, but please let me know what you find out. Irrigation is also important to maximize production. Growth is slow, but it does happen, and we need to replenish it for the plants. This is trickier in the winter, of course. Frozen water lines and increased moisture increases the risk of disease. So it's best to irrigate in the morning on a sunny day when the sun has the opportunity to dry the plants out, especially if you're going to cover them up again at night. You know, if there's a lot of respiration or evaporation while the row cover is on, it can become wet and freeze, which can be a real bear to remove and damage the spinach it's trying to protect. Additionally, venting is important for multiple reasons. Venting your tunnel will help decrease moisture on the leaves. Like we're talking about with the uncovering of the row cover, it helps prevent disease. Downy mildew in particular requires water on the leaf to infect the plant. And also you want to minimize temperature fluctuations. That will help decrease cold damage on the leaves. When there are periods of fast growth, those leaf tissues are more susceptible to cold damage. So keeping the rate of growth steady is important to maintaining good leaf quality. In our tunnel, we have a fan in one end wall and a vent in the other to help pull the humid air that rises up from the beds during the day. You could also open doors or sides. So the best varieties for winter production are the fast growing, fast bolting varieties. Remember, with decreased bolting pressure in the winter, they're not fast bolting in this slot. Tragopan, Garanuk, and Rangitoto, and also the all-season varieties, Space, Sun Angel, and Tarsier. And now a quick note about the all-season varieties. We've been talking about them a lot. They have showed up in every season. These varieties grow relatively fast and bolt relatively slowly, making them suitable for all growing slots. However, they may not be optimized for all of the growing slots, but as our late biennial breeder, Dr. John Navazio, used to say, they always make. So these three varieties will make in every slot. Space is a smooth leaf variety that grows relatively quickly and bolts very slowly. And that makes it a true unicorn. Fast growing and slow bolting is not a common combination in spinach, but it does come as a cost. You know, the leaf texture is very soft. The plant habit is mostly prostrate, and the leaf color, you know, it is the lightest green spinach we sell, even though it does not look like that in this photo. Sun Angel and Tarsier are semi-savoy varieties with round leaves and an upright habit. They're very similar to each other and very different from Space, slower growing than Space and also faster bolting, but much more refined with thick, turgid, heavy leaves and a very handsome Savoy. Real quick, I just want to talk about location. So all of this seasonal variety information is mostly relevant around 35 degrees latitude and north of there. So that includes the northern tier, the central US, mid-Atlantic and central California, and the part of the US that kind of spans that area, and then northerly places in the south. Now, some of these places will still have difficulty growing spinach in the summer. It is pretty common to take a break from spinach production in the summer and focus on the other easier to grow fruiting and salad crops. And that will certainly be the case for the very hot regions of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas, southern Arizona, and other parts of the desert Southwest. And basically, if you live in a place where it's hard to grow greens or anything in the summer because of the heat or humidity, you will likely also have trouble growing spinach, even with varieties that are slotted for summer production. However, the other seasonal slotting information is still relevant. I have seen farmers loving Tragopan, you know, just outside of Orlando, Florida, in as late as early April. So those spring, fall, and winter recommendations might still make a lot of sense for you. And also, if you live in a higher altitude region south of 35 degrees, you might have more luck extending those plantings and those harvest windows. So for example, a farm in the mountains of North Georgia may have more similar growing slots to regions farther north than the low country of South Carolina, for example.
Okay, we're going to wrap things up here with just a few slides talking about spinach diseases. And so before I get into talking about specific diseases, just a quick grounding here in plant pathology. So what is required for a disease to actually occur in your field? In order to have an outbreak of disease, basically 3 things need to happen simultaneously. You need to have an environment that's favorable to the growth and development of the pathogen. That can often be a specific moisture or temperature range, for example. Secondarily, you need to have the pathogen itself present in order to take advantage of that favorable environment that exists. And then thirdly, you have to have a host plant that is susceptible to the particular pathogen in question. And this, of course, is where genetics come into play and can be a really important tool in disease management. We can jump to the next slide. And so we're not going to cover every disease that occurs in spinach. There's a whole range of viruses that we won't get into, but we're just going to touch on a couple of the most commonly occurring diseases that you might encounter. So the first one I want to talk about here is damping off. And damping off is a disease event that really is a combination of multiple pathogens. So Pythium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, these are all soil fungi, and they all affect the germination and early seedling stage of the plant. They can occur individually, but often occur in combination, and in combination in particular can be, very detrimental to your spinach planting. This set of conditions that happens is very common in spinach. Spinach is really susceptible to damping off. And the symptoms that you'll see are poor germination, germinated seedlings dying pre-emergence, so while they're still underground, and then newly emerged seedlings dying soon after emergence. Plants that do survive can have stunted plants, yellowing, poor growth, and wilting. And then with an older plant, you'll see collapse or death of the plant as it's growing. Really terrible set of circumstances to see your whole planting really die as it's coming up out of the ground. And probably many of you have indeed seen that happen. The conditions that cause this to occur are, like Rachel said earlier, really revolve around water and the aeration of the soil. So it's more common to have damping off occur if you have clay soils or poorly drained soils. And then in conditions where there's oversaturation of the soil. In addition, repeated spinach production in the same location will cause a buildup of pathogens and can increase the likelihood that you will see damping off. It's important to note here that the same set of symptoms can occur even in the event that there is no pathogen present when there has been excessive water use. Luckily, the management practices are going to be the same whether it's just an overwatering situation or you have damping off pathogens present. And the management is first to grow on well-drained soils. Using raised beds can really aid also in the drainage in the soil, managing irrigation to prevent saturated soil conditions, and then practicing crop rotation so that you're not building up those pathogens. Okay, Cladosporium leaf spot. So this is another fungus, but in this case, instead of a soil fungus, Cladosporium is a foliar disease. It's one of several leaf spot diseases that can occur in spinach. And Cladosporium is not a major disease that occurs in most of the spinach production areas in the world, but it is known to be problematic in the northern tier of the US, in particular in the tunnel environment, as Rachel mentioned earlier. And as you can see in this photo, the presentation of the disease is you get these kind of shotgun spots across the leaf, and the leaf quickly becomes unmarketable. The management of this disease is going to be very similar to downy mildew, which I'm going to cover next. So just listen there for how to approach the management. And then just, I guess, the final note here is that because this is a foliar fungus, you have spores forming basically inside each of those round lesions. As it advances, you'll have spores on the interior. And so when you're harvesting those leaves, or if you were to remove those plants from your tunnel, there's an opportunity for those spores to be transferred plant to plant. You just want to be aware of that. Garanuk, which Rachel mentioned earlier, has been shown to have field tolerance to Cladosporium and is a good variety for the tunnel. So it will perform in that setting as well as have the resistance. And then final disease we're going to talk about, and of course the most important and prevalent disease of spinach is spinach downy mildew. Just to note that downy mildew, of course, is a common name for a set of symptoms. It's a name that's used across many crops. In spinach, we're talking about Peronospora effusa. That is an obligate pathogen that only occurs on spinach. And it's characterized by powdery gray sporulations on the underside of the leaf, you can see in this image. And then on the overside of the leaf, the appearance of the downy mildew in spinach is a little bit different from what you see in other crops. So you have these sort of amorphous, paler areas of coloration, these like little blobs. You can see it looks bleached out. In other crops, what you'll see is like interveinal discoloration across the leaf. Spinach downy mildew is an oomycete, which is a water mold. So it's actually more closely related to an algae. It's not technically a true fungus. And then spinach races, spinach downy mildew races are identified by the International Working Group on Peronospora. Currently we have 20 downy mildew races identified in spinach. The races must be persistent and economically impactful to be identified by that working group. And so it is important to understand, especially if you are outside the major production regions, that there will be many races that occur in spinach, many downy mildew races that occur that are never identified, either because they're not persistent, they appear and then they disappear, or because they're occurring in regions that aren't economically relevant to the industry and warrant identification. What that means, if you are outside of those regions, like we are here in the Northeast, is that you want to both be testing your own plants when you do have an occurrence of downy mildew to understand what races might be occurring, but also paying attention to where there might be resistance that's not named. So where you have varieties that seem to be resistant to the novel races that are occurring for you. This pathogen adapts very rapidly to new spinach genetics, and we see new races occurring every couple of years. Spinach breeding is very heavily focused on achieving resistance over the most recently identified races of downy mildew in order to maintain relevance and stay ahead of the disease so that there can be successful crops in those major production regions. As a result, we see a quick turnover of spinach varieties on the marketplace. They become irrelevant when they aren't able to deliver that resistance. And just a quick note here too, the resistance for the for kind of the large spinach industry, of course, downy mildew resistance is critical in organic production, but even for conventional, very large commercial spinach producers, they are seeking the resistance because the chemical controls that are available are generally preventative and not able to stop an outbreak once an outbreak occurs. So the genetic resistance is the most critical tool available to growers. So this pathogen, like I said, it's a water mold. It requires cool, wet conditions for infection and disease to occur. And when we think about prevention, again, as I said, these notes apply to Cladosporium as well. When we think about prevention, you can think about the three sides of that disease triangle. So the first is your environment, and we want to try to have that environment not be favorable to the downy mildew pathogen. So the way to do that is for the leaves to have an opportunity to dry out. If those leaves stay moist, disease can occur. Though one of the ways to prevent this, of course, is to manage your irrigation timing. So irrigate early in the day so that the leaves can dry out before evening when temperatures are dropping and the moisture is likely to stay on the leaves longer. Use drip irrigation where possible rather than overhead. If you're growing in particular in an environment where you're using row cover, opening that row cover before the crop is heating up so that you don't get condensation building up, and then providing ventilation. Again, that really important, in particular in the tunnel, having fans, like Rachel said, being able to open up sidewalls so that you're getting airflow across the crop. So secondarily, on that disease triangle, we have the pathogen. In this case, downy mildew can only survive on a living host. It needs plant material to be retained in the location in some way in order to transfer the disease. So practicing good crop rotation, of course, and then removing plant material after a crop. Prevent that green bridge. And then finally, your susceptible host. So you have a lot of opportunity to choose resistant varieties. There are many varieties on the market with the full 1 through 20 resistance. As I said earlier, what's important to understand is that in any particular location, you might experience a race that is not an identified race. And so you need to do some investigating. We highly recommend sending disease plants into your local extension for disease tissue testing to identify the race that you have. That's ideal. If you can't identify the particular race, then choosing varieties that have the broadest resistance possible is a very important preventative strategy for avoiding an outbreak of downy mildew. And I think that wraps it up for us.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Liv, and I've been collecting your questions. So we'll do a Q&A session now. Thanks for your questions. Let's see, maybe we do have a couple questions about disease. Maybe we could start there since that's what we ended on, and then move on to some of the other topics. We had one person who asked about crop rotation, both how much time should there be between two crops of spinach, and then if there are any like bad choices for a crop following spinach.
Yeah, I would say, spinach is in the same plant family as beets and chard. So I would say if you're going to do rotations, you shouldn't follow them with those plants, mostly for nutrient reasons. They do have somewhat different pests and somewhat similar pests, but I would say that's a good rotation strategy. What do you think, Brenna, about number of years?
Yeah, I guess I don't know for sure what the guidelines would be for number of years for rotation.
I would check with your extension service, who probably has some very up-to-date information about that kind of thing.
Great. And then could you sort of give a kind of a basic definition of what is meant by races of a disease like downy mildew, so just kind of like what that means?
Sure. So, so there are different, we all kind of got a crash course during COVID about disease and disease evolution, but there are different isolates of this pathogen, and it evolves, right? So there's a pathogen, a single isolate that infects a plant, and then that plant builds up a resistance to that pathogen, and then the pathogen evolves into a new pathogen that's similar, but different enough that it can reinfect the plant. So there are many isolates of spinach downy mildew, and we have 20 of them named, but it is ever evolving to combat the resistances that we have bred into the newer varieties. It's very adaptable. You know, the genetics of the disease are adapting to allow it to overcome the resistance that we're building in, which is why we have so many numbers, and we add more, you know, every year or two.
And you can think about it's exactly the same mechanism as like the annual flu. So, you know, you get your flu shot every year because the flu is always evolving.
I guess
encountered with a different strain of the flu. I think my connection was breaking up on us.
But I think we got you. Different strain of the flu.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we had a few different questions. So I know, Rachel, you started off sort of saying that direct seeding is sort of the preferred seeding method, but there are some instances where transplanting might be beneficial. And we had a few different questions just on sort of tips for indoor seed starting and transplanting. I don't know if you want to sort of speak again to the situations in which transplanting might be appropriate, and then if you have any sort of tips for germination that you want.
Yeah, I mean, your tips for germination of spinach, both in the field and in trays, are to just try to have the soil be kind of cool and well drained. So even if you're seeding in trays in the summer, you're probably going to need to move those trays into a cooler spot than your greenhouse for germination. We do this with lettuce also. Actually, we put them in like a cool, dark room until they pop, and then we move them into the greenhouse to get the sun. But you're going to want to keep the temperature of the soil down and the moisture even and not too saturated to get good germination, both in the field or in the greenhouse environment for flats. Okay. And you're going to want to transplant. You don't want that root to get too big. You know, you really want to transplant just at like the first true leaf stage. You really don't want to give it a long time in those trays. Just as soon as you can pull it out. You know, use a small tray like a 128, and then, or even, what's the size even smaller than that? 210? I can't even remember, 2 something. Use something really small that you can transplant really quick. You could also maybe do it in 20-row flats just to get them germinated, and then transplant that whole little strip from the 20-row flat. But also the paper pot transplanter works well because you really don't disturb those roots while you're transplanting if you get them small enough. And you can transplant like pretty close together without much work.
Great. And then there was a question about spacing when you're transplanting. The question was about spacing and transplanting in the winter tunnel. I'm not sure if you do transplant in the winter tunnel, but
we don't transplant in the winter tunnel. We direct seed and then we thin. But transplanting does work well in the winter tunnel because it's fewer. You know, a bed in a field could be 100 feet. You know, 200 feet. You may have 3 or 4 of them. That's a lot of transplanting. In the winter tunnel, it's a much more manageable amount. But it really depends on your harvest strategy. You know, you can transplant densely. You can grow your plants densely and harvest them smaller, or you can grow them further apart and harvest the leaves when they're larger. We have found, actually, we've grown both, and we grow both simultaneously. We do a high density planting right next to a lower density planting, and we harvest some leaves at a smaller size than larger leaves. And we have found that mostly the yield is the same overall between the harvesting the leaves smaller and planted closer together and harvesting them larger when the plants are planted farther apart. So it's really what your market wants, how frequently you want to harvest, and kind of what works for your situation. So you can plant them as close as 1 inch apart, or you could plant them as far apart as 6 inches. You know, it really depends on how you want to manage your tunnel.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we had a few kind of variety specific questions. One was, does the color, like depth of green, correlate with flavor? Yeah.
We have not found that, but we don't do that much flavor evaluations of spinach.
I think the thing that will trump it, like it is possible, right, that an extremely pale spinach compared to a very dark one would have a slightly different flavor profile. But I think the thing that will trump that by far is going to be the growing conditions. So, you know, you're going to have flavor change with heat and, like Rachel said, with cold, and that's going to be a much stronger influence than the color selection of the variety that you would pick.
Okay. And then there was a question about the Savoy varieties. Does that extra loft in the leaf help with like with its ability to be in storage longer?
I'm going to say a little bit, yes, because it's a little bit slower growing, and that does help. You know, having those smaller cells really keep something fresher a little bit longer. But you know, those spring and summer productions that are just like growing really, really fast, those leaves are, you know, when they're growing fast like that, it's very hard to get really long storage on them. They're just so full of water, you know, they're just growing so much.
Great. Okay. And then let's see. So for red snapper, the one with the red vein, there's a question, does it retain that red vein in cooking?
Yes, I believe it does.
And red snapper, the really cool thing about red snapper is that it makes a really nice like baby leaf variety. It's a really nice addition to like a salad mix or to mix with lettuce or brassica greens. It grows very densely, and the leaves are small enough to be like a baby leaf size for a long time. And it's really a nice like baby leaf salad addition.
Nice. So another question here, why is there so little organic spinach seed available?
Yeah, that's it's it's a long story. So, but the quick version is that spinach seed production is quite challenging, and producing under organic conditions is all the more challenging, and can often lead to crop loss and crop failure. And so there has been kind of a migration on the production side of spinach for many companies to really abandon their attempts to produce organic spinach because it is economically untenable for them to do so. So if that makes sense, so it's really a production's cost driven trend versus a lack of demand or a lack of interest on the part of a breeding company to offer organic seed. It's clear that there's a market for organic seed, and if it were more feasible to produce that, there would be more available. But that's kind of the quick version of the story.
That's great. Thank you. I think we'll make this next question our last for the evening. This is kind of, hopefully this is an easy one, but I'd like to know what your favorite or maybe top couple favorite spinach varieties are.
You can go first, Rachel.
Well, I don't believe in favorites.
Okay.
Everything's great in its own time. That's my take on it. But I really like Garanuk in the winter tunnel. I like now I have to think about all the I'm pulling up my list of variety names. I feel on the spot.
I'll throw mine out there. I really like the Tragopan and Auroch that we had prior because they're just dynamite producers in the winter tunnel. So it's been really fun to encounter them, and they're pretty exciting varieties.
And you know them when you see them because they're really not like anything else. So that's nice too. I like Rangitoto in the fall also. It's really lovely.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Joshua for a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Liv. Thank you, Rachel and Brenna, for sharing your spinach expertise with us today. And to our audience, we appreciate your questions. We're sorry if we couldn't respond to all of them today. If you do still have a question regarding any of these topics today or in spinach in general, please reach out to us via phone, email, or live chat. Our team is ready to support you. And a recording of today's presentation, as previously noted, along with the slide deck and additional resources, will be available at johnnyseeds.com Saturday morning, March 21st. You're going to receive an email momentarily. It's going to have a link to the webpage where we will post those resources on Saturday. We hope you'll join us in 2 weeks on April 2nd for our next webinar focused upon growing sweet potatoes from slip to storage. Looking forward to that one. And then finally, special thanks to all of you who joined us today. We hope you found this presentation informative and helpful as you make plans for selecting and slotting spinach in the seasons ahead. Until next time, best wishes from all of us, the employee owners at Johnny's, and thank you.
Bye, everyone.